I looked up to you when I read your work, and I was very touched by your work. It resonated something very deep in my heart, and I said, we must get Daniel to talk to everybody who are amongst our colleagues and the people with whom we are learning. And you didn't know me. I just reached out to you. And thank you for your generosity. And thank you for accepting to be with us today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's really an honor and a great opportunity to learn together.
Thank you. This is an opportunity for us to have this conversation. We began several weeks back, and we began by first talking to the chairman of Dr. Reddy's lab, and his name is G.V. Prasad. And then we had the second conversation with T.V. Narendran, who is this global managing director of Tata Steel. And then the third conversation we had was with this amazing colleague of ours called William Bissell, who heads an organization called Fab India. With Prasad, who has this pharma company with a deep soul, he talked about how within hours of starting this whole Corona crisis challenge, which they were confronted with literally within hours, how his people got around, how they self-organized themselves into starting the manufacturing of sanitizers in his plants, and within hours of the crisis starting, and how people felt so empowered to say we should now begin to take responsibility for the poor homeless people who don't have food, and as to how they started self-organizing themselves and started cooking meals for the poor people, 25,000 meals in a day. And, you know, so that was an amazing story to see what they were trying to do, including making all the PPE manufacturing possible and supporting the local governments everywhere, including in many global locations where Dr. Reddy is. From Tata Steel, we learned really the spirit of the house of Tatas and about their generosity and about the way they serve the larger well-being of all. And he talked several things about how in his own life he was inspired by the higher purpose of the Tata Group. And then we saw this incredible story of William Bissell, where he was the first entrepreneur in India who made the weavers who were part of the supply chain actually shareholders in his company. So that was quite remarkable. And so with these conversations now, here we are with you, Daniel. So thank you once again. And maybe I begin my first question by asking you, when you look back at your life and the story of your life, what stands out for you as those moments in your life which you recall as the moments that have special meaning in your heart for you?
Yeah, I used to be a marine biologist, and what drove me to study biology and zoology was wanting to understand how life works, but much more from a sort of Humboldt natural philosopher understanding of life as this planetary abundance. And I ended up being in California studying elephant seals during the breeding season, and over 3 months learning so much being with these animals. But then when it came to going into the lab and writing down my research report and doing the statistics on the data we had collected, I suddenly felt I was only telling a very small part of the story. Like there was so much more that I'd learned being in the presence of these animals that science wasn't allowing me to even communicate, because it wasn't in the boxes of statistically significant figures. And I remember very specific moments sitting, watching these animals during the breeding season and thinking the best way I can serve marine mammals in the long run is to deal with my own species, not to study whales and dolphins or seals for the rest of my life, only to see them go extinct, but that there's something wrong about, not wrong about the scientific enterprise and using statistics and using technology and using science. It's wonderful, but we somehow lost sight of what connects the larger whole, within which this is a very useful tool, but not the only one. And so, yeah, for me, that moment was a real eye-opener that changed my life in terms of taking a different path and working with my own species in order to ultimately help the dolphins.
What a remarkable story. And tell me, when did your own consciousness expand to say you have to really start taking responsibility for this, for serving this planet that we all live in? And, you know, how was that from that moment to how did it help you to begin to study the kind of things that you did, the kind of research that you did? Can you share with us all those important moments?
Mm. Interesting questions. Actually, it was, so after my initial study of biology, I couldn't quite let go of the marine environment yet, and spent some time as a scuba diving instructor in Central America, and then also in Thailand. And another key moment for me was to realize that kind of hedonistic lifestyle of living wonderfully within nature, seeing beautiful reefs, was ultimately contributing to more people learning how to dive and more people destroying the reef. So the whole industry of more tourism onto the reef, I was complicit in what I was trying to protect, no matter how much I told people to be careful with the corals. And that's when I started to ask myself the question, what would it look like to live life as part of a solution pathway rather than as part of contributing to a growing problem? The degeneration of our environment, the breakdown of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity, which ultimately mean a loss of planetary health, which is intimately linked with our health and our future. So, and that's when I started, at that point, in a very youthful sort of, I will build the new model and they will come kind of idea, to think about creating an eco-village and environmental education center in southern Spain, which was in 1999, a long time ago. And I went to Spain. Actually, the key moment happened in India, in Dharamsala, when I realized I was sitting just above Dharamsala in Baksu, looking over that part of the Himalayas, and thinking, I know another part of the world that looks very similar, and it's closer to Europe and closer to my roots, which was southern Spain. And it was in that moment that I thought, okay, I'll move to southern Spain and I will try to create a small community that tries to live in an experimental way the solutions, and then tries to teach them to other people. And of course, that was still quite the classic dropout dream. And in trying to live it, I realized that there were so many dimensions that I still had to learn a lot more about, and that it wasn't all about solar panels and straw bale buildings and the technology side of things, and how we build our houses, how we clean our water, how we generate our energy. All of that is really important. But the social dimension, and how we make decisions together, and how we create a story that unites us in diversity, rather than spending all that energy trying to agree on everything, which will probably never happen. That's when I got onto the path to then go to Schumacher College. I did a master's in holistic science at Schumacher College, where I learned about design being the first signal of human intention, as Bill McDonough said. It's the way that our hopes and our visions for the world we could create, how we could meet human needs in better ways, starts with intentionality and then turns into design. So there's an act of design in everything, but upstream from that is our worldview and our value system. And at Schumacher College, I learned about this holistic, dynamic, complexity theory rooted and Gaia theory rooted understanding of how science was trying to make sense of a living planet, of a transforming whole that we're all part of. But I also wanted to see, how do we put this interaction, and meeting mentors like David Orr or John Todd at Schumacher College, which was founded by Satish Kumar, another Indian, was realizing that, okay, design is the way that we can bring the diversity of specialized knowledge and skills that we've created in 250 years of industrial revolution and scientific revolution and all that. I'm not denying the benefits of that, but we need to somehow bring these diverse disciplines that give us deep knowledge about something very detailed and narrow, and come back together in using these insights to understand the whole and the dynamics of the whole. And when we start to do that, then we realize that it is in our enlightened self-interest to save our ecosystems, to work for our communities, to heal the planet, because by healing the planet, we heal ourselves. And we cannot serve only the individual interest without understanding our part in also being of service to the larger whole, from which we draw all our significance and meaning. Yeah, I'll stop there.
That's very, very inspiring. In this journey, from that moment in Dharamshala where suddenly your consciousness expanded and it was revealed to you that what you may be doing in the rest of your life, and as the journey has gone on in the last 20 years and more, what are the special gifts that you have discovered in yourself as the talent that you have been given, which is enabling you to do all this work?
Ooh. It's an interesting question in the sense that it sort of pulls it back into my own self story, and I find that in this dance, that for me, designing regenerative cultures, or the intention to live regenerative practice, is about the polarity between being, I think all life lives in this polarity of being for itself as an individual, so to speak, but also as being part of a larger whole. And we all live in this tension. And I mean, I'm taking owls to Athens, as they would say. This is like the Vedanta has been speaking about this for a very, very long time. Yeah? The notion that in order to really integrate ego and eco, you know, the now very famous, I think through the work of Otto Scharmer and Thea Ryu, a lot of people now like to show these two graphics: the pyramid, where the human being is at the top of the graphic, and you have a sort of chain of life underneath, and they call that the eco. And then there's another graphic where it's a circle and humanity is back inside nature. And on the one hand, that's communicating something really important, that we've never been separate from nature. We're not masters of nature. We have to integrate and into the ecosystem. But I find that the very framing of going from ego to eco doesn't hold the wisdom that true potentiality comes from that tension in that polarity of being for oneself and being for the whole. And for me, the notion of seva, which is again central to your culture, is where it unites, where by being of service to the whole, I'm being of service to myself. And for me, that is at the heart of trying to create communities that explore how can we, in this place, with the wealth and wisdom that this place itself has, not just the people in it, but the place itself has a story and a history and a culture that informs. And then the people have the same. And so each regenerative culture would be very, very different in each bioregion, each place. And you have some wonderful, in India, some wonderful bioregional regeneration projects going on, where people are beginning to re-identify and re-inhabit at a scale that is more biophysical reality rather than socio-political borders drawn with the ruler of a ruler in the past. And so for me, it's this: how do we live in a way that we are in service to the communities and the planet, but also serve ourselves? That is what our most important journey is. And your question made me realize how, for me personally, the biggest thing to accept is that I also need to serve myself. Because I spent a long time sort of trying in the do-gooder world, as they sometimes say, that with the NGOs and trying to save humanity and all that. And you very quickly realize that in order to sustain the effort of being of service to community and world, you also have to make sure that you're in the conditions to do so. And so for me, it's hard to speak about my own gifts, because I still have a little bit of work to do to not judge myself if I go down that path. But the thing that I'm passionate about, to give you an answer to your question, is how does it all connect? How does it all, like to really understand myself as a reflection of this ongoing journey that is life as a planetary evolutionary process. And some of my mentors in the Regenesis group and Regenesis Institute that work with this, the different methodologies and frameworks of regenerative practice, they have this beautiful term, which is co-evolving mutuality. And I think that's, again, like seva. And my gift, or my passion, is how to see the bigger picture and make the system more visible to itself, and pay attention to the qualities of the relationships in the system and the qualities of the information that flows, in order to, I like to use the word weaving, to weave the kind of imaginal cells of this global growing network that is beginning to be, from the inside out of this living planet, part of a planetary immune response, as Paul Hawken called it, to the converging crises we're facing. And my work is really all about lifting up the work of others and making them see each other, and making them realize also how their work is synergistic and contributes to the overall goal of healing the whole, so we can heal ourselves, and serving all of humanity in order to also serve the planet. And I've been on that journey for 20 years, and it's a rewarding journey. It's for me, it's a meaningful context in which I can live my life in a way that fulfills me. And sometimes I get lost in pretending that I have to do most of it, which is, of course, absolutely ridiculous and self-deluded. I'm just doing my little part of it.
Thank you. This present crisis, Daniel, that we are facing, some people say this is something which is the so-called manifestation of what humanity and the human race was bringing itself to, that this is an expression of the larger aspect of how are we treating and serving the whole. And some people call that as an inevitable part of the way we were evolving and ignoring what the planet and Mother Earth were trying to tell us. There is one view. The other view is that it's a major accident that has happened, and this is something that... So there are all kinds of people trying to understand and grapple with the complexity of this crisis, which has brought everybody literally to their knees, and nobody seems to know as to how this is going to play out. So how do you read this whole crisis, and how do you read the way we are responding to it? And what does your wisdom enable us to, how does it enable us to make sense out of what's going on?
Well, it's okay. You're not asking the easy questions. I think I should start with saying that you're absolutely right. Everybody's trying to grapple with this, and I think anybody pretending that they have analyzed it and they now know how to respond and what to do would also have a certain amount of delusion, because I think we're just right in the middle of it. And if I've learned one thing from my work in future scenario planning and working with governments on black swan events and possible disruptions to kind of be prepared for, is the systemic connections that are now running, the domino pieces that are falling and running off in different chains, crisscrossing and touching other chains. They're so complex that they are now unfolding. This is running in response to our response to the virus, that we will see exponential change and breakdown of certain supply lines 3 months later, 6 months later, so in surprise, because what this situation is doing is it's turning up the contrast on how brittle, how non-resilient our globalized system and our globalized supply chains really are, in ways that Indian drug companies stop making generic drugs for export, not just because they also need to provide for the local population, but because China is making the chemical ingredients that are needed to make those drugs. And it's just one example of how everything is now globally so interconnected that we're still seeing an unfolding of the effects of this that I don't think anybody can really predict. But what I do feel is that we're also very quickly, people started not to say, how quickly can we go back to normal? Very quickly, many people, not just a few activists or a few visionaries, but many people started to say, actually, there was a lot of structural violence and inefficiency and patterns that no longer served and that were actually running against the wall just a little bit down the road in the old normal, that we might as well admit to us that if we now have to spend unprecedented amounts of resources, human commitment and willingness to collaborate locally, regionally, nationally, globally in response to a common thread and a common challenge, then why not start thinking about solving other much more pressing problems that were actually killing more people every day prior to this outbreak than this outbreak is currently causing in victims. I mean, just if we think about the amount of people globally who still die because they don't have access to drinking water every day, and the amount of young children who die like that, it's huge numbers. And we kind of, for me personally, part of what this crisis did was that when I felt deeply emotional about watching those nurses in Italy when the first magnitude of this was becoming visible, and how they were forced to make decisions that I would not want any human being to have to make, which is this person lives, this person dies. And how it touched me to the point that I was breaking down in tears and feeling enormous empathy and compassion with this situation. And then suddenly this voice came in and to asking myself, why did you not have that response knowing the statistics, how many children die because they don't have access to water? Or why do you ignore the fact that all over India, Africa, there are places where in hospitals the supplies are not good enough and where doctors and nurses have to make similar decisions every day? And so for me, in many ways, whether it's in the social inequity and not caring for the human family and solidarity way, but also in terms of our business model, our production model, our economic model, they're all shown to be much more brittle than we thought they were. And we need to now make a massive effort to do something. We don't know what yet. And what I sense is that everything that I've been talking about prior with regard to how do we design regenerative cultures at the right scale with the right sensitivity to the local bioregion and the health of local ecosystems is actually relevant as a long-term strategic COVID response, because we know that these pandemics happen faster because ecosystems are degrading, and it's much easier for the transmission from animals to humans to happen. We know that there's now a research network globally called the Planetary Health Alliance that includes the best universities in the world, 270 institutions around the world that research the link between ecosystems and planetary health and human population health and individual health, and clearly say we can not afford the health crisis we're running into if our industry keeps creating the environment it is creating right now. So for me, the re-regionalization of production and consumption wherever possible, I'm not saying let's stop global trade, no, not at all. There's lots of technology that we need to provide for all of humanity in a fair way globally. But food security, water security, educational security, basic housing from local materials, all those things are pathways to diversifying and creating vibrant local and bioregional economies. And we need to create these in unison with whatever we turn the global economy into. I think we need to shrink the global, we've been a little bit, as we always do, we overswing the pendulum. We were local people and then we became global people. But instead of realizing what was the gift of being local and regional, what is it that is in the teaching that our species throughout its whole history, for 99% of it, has been a bioregional species taking care of the local ecosystems in order to protect themselves. And then we have enough stories of civilizations collapsing that didn't do that. So yeah, for me, we need to open up to a much wider conversation about what is the new normal that we want to create. And I think that's the best way to spend our time, rather than now predicting what we have to create immediately, because nothing has changed. Like, there's too much moving to make a sensible, wise response right now. Apart from, of course, there are certain emergency responses that are needing to be done as well. I think we should open up the space to have these conversations around how do we create a world that works for all? How do we go beyond sustainability to undo the damage that we've done in the world and restore ecosystems? We're moving into the UN decade for ecosystems restoration. I think we should take that decade really serious as a COVID-19 response. We have a commitment that we need to respond to climate change. We can respond to climate change in the context also of a sensible COVID-19 response. So I think it's systemic thinking and long-term planning that is now asked. We need to realize that what our generation is called to do now will be finished by our great-grandchildren.
Thank you. You know, when I think about this, Daniel, the issue that really I come up with is that this whole model of capitalism that has been defined, and the so-called open market, and therefore the businesses and the way they measure themselves and the way they sort of report to their stakeholders on what progress they are making. Obviously, the system has to be questioned a lot. That is that model of capitalism even working?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
and therefore, how are business leaders, because if even in this crisis, business leaders are talking about where is my cash flow and how do I take care of my sales in the second quarter and third quarter, and how do I pay the bonuses to my staff? If these are the kind of questions executives are asking, clearly business is failing society, because if business is not taking responsibility for the way we live now, there is something fundamentally wrong in our educational system, in the way businesses are set up, organized, measured, and rewarded. So what is your thinking about how can we teach revolution to the ruling class, which is to tell business itself how it needs to completely transform itself if it has to contribute to a better future for businesses and for society at large?
I think that the survival response for business leaders would actually be to say, we're willing to do our bit, but we are in an uneven playing field. The playing field itself is a zero-sum game of winners and losers that is structurally dysfunctional in the sense that because of the way our monetary systems are structured and there are differential interests for loans and deposits, we actually create the need. You can only have winners if there are losers. So somewhere somebody needs to go bankrupt for somebody to be a successful business. But also the need for continuous growth, 3% per annum, to keep this system going is structurally designed into the system. And so how can you build, I know I work with a lot of interesting visionary medium-sized business leaders, small and medium, international as well, that would really like to build a regenerative business, but realize they can't. I mean, a couple of end of last year, Yvonne Cunard from Patagonia said, they told me my company is $1 billion turnover company. I was dreading that moment because I knew that by that time I'd be too large to do the work that in the way that it needs to be done. There is a sort of too big not to fail that our economic system currently incentivizes. And that's why I see that large multinational companies should begin to look at themselves as, what do we really hold? The quality of people we hold, the skills we hold, the assets we hold. There's a lot of richness and potential in all of this. But what is the way to restructure this in a way that we can serve more regional and local economies and link into local communities and the communities we serve? But they can only do it if they start the political conversation with the regional and national governments and global changes in global regulation. Because right now, you were sort of saying the so-called, you didn't call it the free market, but earlier. It reminded me of one of my friends, Kenny Osbol, who started the Pioneers Network in California or in the States. He said, when people talk about the free market, I always want to ask them, is that an imperative, the free, or is that an adjective? Because right now we don't have a free market. We have a hyper-regulated market. If we have markets regulated in such a way that they de-incentivize or work against local and regional businesses, because only large corporate structures can actually cut prices in the way that, because of externalized social and environmental impact, they can make the balance sheets work to sell a product below the price that it actually should be sold by. And regional production for regional consumption that is taking care of local ecosystems and is regenerative by design and creates circular, cyclical economic production models that are at the right scale. Because that's the thing about the big conversation about the circular economy. There's a lot of wisdom in there, but it's very often thought of in too large of a scale. We need to pay more attention to what do we produce at what scale for whom, and how do we transform the international structures more as knowledge exchange, innovation, and collaboration networks that enable regional and local production to be going smoothly. That's my personal vision, because I'm informed by how ecosystems work, and ecosystems need that scale linking resilience where changes at the local and the regional and the global interact over different time periods. And if we build our production system to mimic these ecosystem patterns, then we're much more likely to fit our human need meeting into also serving life as a wider community. And it's a big big vision, but I think it's informed by how life works.
Thank you. Monica from Portugal, she's asking a question. She says, from my perspective as an European, sadly with zero to some knowledge of the ancient Vedanta philosophy, born and raised in Portugal, a small country almost, and the tail or beginning of Europe, I'd like to know how perception can hinder our path in our journey to the better version of oneself.
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's one of my mentors, Fritjof Capra, who I first met in 2001 at Schumacher College, wrote, I think in 1985, in a little book called The Turning Point, that the ecological crisis, the social crisis, and the deepening economic crises that we're facing around the planet all have one common source, which is a crisis of perception or a crisis of consciousness. And then he basically suggests that it is this Cartesian split, this believing that we are separate from nature, that is at the heart of us acting in a way that we think we can just take and take and take without giving back. But where I started, living for oneself and living as part of a larger whole means that the only way to be fed by the whole is to give more than you take. And that's the perceptual change. And I've just been doing some work in Portugal and with people in Portugal, and there's actually a growing movement of regenerative practitioners and people wanting to work on this vision of creating more regionally based regenerative cultures. And Portugal is beautifully placed as one country where this can be done, because it's a relatively small country and it's got 5 or 6 very distinct bioregions, and it has huge opportunity in that area.
So Sarthak Roy Chowdhury, who used to be till recently the head of HR for Whirlpool for the Asia Pacific region and a former colleague of mine, he's asking a question that the journey you have embarked upon is vast, complex and interconnected with numerous people and agencies. Do you sometimes get lost, and then what does that, how do you sort of get back on track and stay focused?
That's a wonderful question, especially from somebody with his background. Thank you for that. And sometimes I tug on my mask and I ask, what am I actually doing? Because I'm completely aware that in this intersection between wanting to work on worldview and value system change, and that is through education. I've been mainly working as an educator and creating education programs and content and processes in order to help people think differently. Like Buckminster Fuller, one of my other people who've inspired me a lot, said that if you, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dog outside. He said, if you want people to think differently, don't tell them what to think, give them a tool, the use of which will make them think differently. And that's been my motto when I try to design educational programs or educational material. But to answer the question, yeah, I'm on the one hand working with a wonderful foundation that is called the Cloudburst Foundation, which has started a process with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, working with the 53 nations in the Commonwealth to explore how they could embark on a regenerative development pathway. And of course, the Secretariat only has a sort of advisory or convocatory function. It doesn't, every nation is of course sovereign in that network of the Commonwealth, but the very fact that a network of people that together comprises 2.3 billion people around the planet and crossing all the religious faith groups and crossing like lots of low-lying islands in climate change endangered areas. So it's a fascinating cross-section of humanity that we started for the last 3 years, this long journey of creating this dialogue. And there's now a foundation called Common Earth, common.earth, that has set up to support a regenerative development roadmap building in those 53 countries. And of course, not all at once. There's no capacity, no funding for that. But we're starting with few countries. And interestingly enough, Costa Rica, which is not part of the Commonwealth, is becoming one of the pilot cases for the road mapping process. So that's on the one end of the spectrum. On the other hand of the spectrum, I've worked with Guy Education for many years, designing, for example, these flashcards to get communities thinking around how to implement the sustainable development goals at the local and bioregional scale. And they cognitively prime people to think from a social, ecological, economic, and worldview dimension about each individual goal, which already makes them think much more systemically and holistically. And I could go on, then I try, of course, to walk my talk here on the island of Mallorca, where I feel that islands are wonderful case study for regional transition, but it's long-term work, and I'm dancing between doing that work for the last 10 years and also doing global advocacy work, and I get lost in it sometimes. But I think that to answer the question shortly would be to say I trust that because I can't predict and control the system, if I listen deeply enough in all the madness and in the middle of the white water around me, then I will do the right thing at the right time. And sometimes it's more coming from an interior of, okay, now I need to pick this up. And sometimes it doesn't, there's a voice in me that said, that doesn't make sense. You have a deadline in 2 days, you need to write this paper. Yeah, but this email is now really important. And the catalytic possibility that this has is actually, I'll deal with the paper some other way. Just as an example, but the hard part is, yes, I do get overwhelmed with it sometimes. And then the only way to deal with that overwhelm is to come back to the breath and to the moment and to stillness and to say, I choose to conversation. Yes, I'm stressed, but that's because I care about all these things. And then I can go back to it and choose to do them, but I don't feel a victim of it anymore. And I'm saying that, and practice is a different thing. It doesn't work every day.
Thank you. You know, a colleague from the Chinmaya Organization of Rural Development, which serves the poorest of the poor in the country. And it's a spiritual organization founded by Swami Chinmayananda, one of the greatest sons of the country, and has built a worldwide organization in Vedant. And I am also a student of that subject and a devotee for all my life. So Narendran, who works in Kangla district in Dharamshala, amongst all the villages there, I mean, hundreds of villages they have been serving for a long time now and have done some remarkable work. He's asking a question. He says, how can we initiate and build conviction amongst all intellectuals and so-called well-read businessmen who understand this well, but they fail to put it into practice and keep on compromising the future of existing as well as the upcoming generation? Is it promoting independence or interdependence? And how do we achieve this breakthrough with business leaders? How can we confront them with the myopic vision? Because at the intellectual level, they seem to get it. But in running their businesses every day, they don't take responsibility for the larger whole. So how can we create this? I mean, a similar question to my question on teaching revolution to the ruling class.
Well, I need to retreat back briefly into, in my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, there are 250 questions. And one of the themes that runs through the book is that maybe we've got it wrong by being so overly focused on answers and solutions. And we regard questions always as this quick transitory mean to get to an answer, get to a solution, scale up the solution. Yeah? Maybe a true wisdom culture would pass questions from one generation to the next as the compass that can guide into a better future, rather than answers and solutions. And so it's a huge question, how to do that. My sense is that part of this crisis of perception, by separating self and world, we also get into the habit of separating into dualistic opposites in general. And so people say, yeah, this is a wonderful theory and I believe it, and at the same time, but I need to run my business and the two can't be combined. And how can we install a conversation or invite a conversation that says, rather than getting trapped in this either or perspective, can we see what potential comes when we actually try to work with the wisdom that is in both points of view, but from the understanding that each point of view is always limited. And so I think by bringing the work of re-inhabiting Earth and healing our communities to the scale of communities and bioregions, we come to a scale at which we can live these complex questions with complex stakeholders or shareholders or rights holders, and come to a common, like in all our diversity, come to a common way forward. If we try to solve it at the planetary scale, we'll just continue talking. So for me, it's not, it is all about interdependence. But one of my mentors, Bill Reed, said to me at one point a couple of months ago, Daniel, there's no way that we could ever save the planet. I mean, of course, it's about saving humanity. If anything, the planet will be fine without us. But he said, you can't save the planet, but you can save places. And so if we have our conversations of how to do it differently with a focus on a place, in a culture, within a bioregional context and the biophysical limits of place, in awareness of the biophysical limits of the planet and global solidarity, then we can actually begin to have this complex conversation, to my mind. And businesses are now forced to fundamentally rethink their practices, because so much is based on this, like everybody jumping on planes. And I don't think that's going to come back in the same way, the way it was. And the climate will be happy for it, or better off for it. But that means that so many of our business models have to be rethought. And my great invitation, not saying I know the solutions and you need to follow me, I'm making suggestions based on how life works, would be to have these conversations of what needs to be global in order to enable more regional activity and diversify and get more people, because we also need everybody involved in this. It's not just few business leaders or political leaders doing something that is then accepted by the citizens. No, this needs to be both top down and bottom up, supporting each other in a very participatory endeavor to create an alternative to an old normal that was maybe giving us another 3 or 4 decades before disaster would have hit in ways that would make this current crisis look very minute.
Deen Dayalan, who works at the grassroots level amongst a large number of organizations in the country, he says a Gandhian thought of self-sustained villages is probably the new norm with technology than mindless materialism. To what extent do you identify with what Gandhi had to say about self-sustained communities?
I mean, I think it's a normal part of, yes. On the one hand, I don't use self-sufficiency as a term. Self-reliance is a slight nuance of that, in the sense that, yes, if we can, I don't think the village scale by itself is big enough that you can create the whole system's design to integrate a kind of population that we have now on the planet. So that's why more and more people are starting to realize that to create healthy communities and healthy villages, they have to be in a bioregional context, and bioregions normally also have to include cities. And what do we do and how do we repattern our cities? Because they are vast and very impactful on the planet at this point. So for me, Gandhi was definitely onto the architecture of subsidiarity, where people in place can make decisions about the things that matter to them is critical. And for that, there needs to be a certain amount of self-reliance at the local and bioregional scale. But if we fall into that as another pendulum swing without having conversations around the global architecture of collaboration and solidarity that we need, then I think it will be difficult to actually create a world where all communities everywhere can be self-reliant and self-sufficient in that way. So it's, again, scale linking. We need to pay attention to local, regional, and global at the same time.
Nupur Todi, a former colleague who works with PricewaterhouseCoopers, she says this crisis has made us realize what's essential and what's not. And do you think we would go back to basics to survive as organizations and humans? And could you share some examples of leaders of businesses who are thinking systemically and sustainability conscious businesses?
Well, of course, most people will be familiar with the network of B corporations, and the different scales of very well-meaning business leaders trying to take their businesses into a more sustainable and regenerative direction. And they're all dancing with this paradox that you can't create a regenerative or sustainable business in a degenerative or unsustainable economic system and playing field. But B corporations are an example. Some of the attempts in the We Mean Business Alliance around climate change and are also doing good work in a transition sense. And what I find particularly interesting is out of this conversation of the B corporations that was still very much focused just on the company and what the company does, in South America, under the leadership and inspiration of a man called Pedro Tarak, there's been a growing network of what they call Sistema B, the B system. And that includes lawyers, it includes another sub-company or endeavor, which is B cities, Ciudades B, how do we create more sustainable and regenerative cities. And that is beginning to be diverse and scale linked across Latin America, a network that is actually able to hold some relationships if we end up being surprised and the current domino effects actually lead to a breakdown of the current economic system, because there is a possibility that in the next 2 or 3 years we see the current economic system forcing a redesign by partially or fully collapsing.
Amit Jain, who is managing director with a company called Julon in the Middle East, he asked that this pandemic has created such a massive and fundamental issues for industries like airlines and hotels that their business models are just getting completely turned on their head. In such uncertain scenarios, how do executives create a thinking process for sustainable business model which can survive these kinds of issues given the current crisis?
Well, I don't want to repeat myself, but for me, the only way to make sense of these complexities with the amount of uncertainty and that is coming at us is to limit the scale at which I try to tackle the problem, and then look at whether there are patterns there that serve other places. And so for me, I live on an island that roughly the statistics are 45% of the economy is direct tourism and 80% of the economy is in total is indirectly dependent on tourism. So Mallorca in the Mediterranean. That means I live in a bioregion that is an island that had an economy collapse completely at the moment. And so there are many places like that around the world, which could serve us as case studies of saying, how could we do this differently? How, rather than pretending that we will get back to these unsustainable numbers of tourists a year that we had before, how could we envision that we might have some tourism in the future, but maybe 30, 40, 50% of what was there before. And then how would we now respond to, like in the next 2 or 3 years, so much money will have to be spent on those people that used to work in tourism and now need retraining in other ways. Why don't we create wise plans? And this is where the business people could come in, to do much more work with local government and local communities for regional transition strategies, to really build resilience at the bioregion. And in this experiment of doing it with serving a specific group of people in a specific regions, there will be learning experiences that could then be used in global networks of more internationally operating business that for example, I keep telling the hoteliers here on Mallorca that have hotels and tourist villages all over the world, to say, well, let's use Mallorca as the case study for how even a severely hit tourism can eventually become a supportive process of re-regionalization. And if you do that, you could do that anywhere in the world where you become an investor in local food security, in local renewable energy, in local water treatment infrastructure, to basically create a system that is less brittle than the one that we've got at the moment.
Thank you. Just the last couple of minutes, but if you can answer just this in 1 minute. Rahul Jam from Aditya Birla Group is asking, what does biologically inspired whole system design thinking, how can that teach businesses how to engage in transformative innovation? And some of the young students are from soil like Sneha Yadav and others are asking very similar questions.
To answer in 1 minute, I would have to say if you put into a search engine my name and Medium, which is a aggregator blog, there will be 450 or more articles of 20 years of exploring that question, and I can't answer it in a minute. Yeah.
Daniel, what a joy to have you on this. I learned the following 5 things from you today. 1, we are all interconnected. Our spirit invokes us to serve the well-being of all. There's an urgent need for us to get together and to have a deep and meaningful conversation so that we can truly take responsibility for where we live now. We cannot ignore all these contradictions that are around. We will be drawn at one time to our own inner core telling us this is what the guidance we are receiving. On the other hand, we will also be pushed to act in the environment now, and we have to live with this paradox. And lastly, what is most important is to do the work that each one of us is supposed to do. We get guided on what is in our best interest, and in serving others, we will find ourselves. So I really appreciate you for this wonderful evening today and for the gift of your time. And thank you very much, and look forward to continuing to be in touch with you and to learning from you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really...
Thank you. Thank you.
So,